Hello, thanks for tuning in. This is History in Lowell. My name is Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my personal professor, my history partner in crime, Bob Forrant. How you doing, Bob?
I'm good. How are you? And welcome back to Lowell.
I'm so happy to be home. And I'm particularly excited about today's topic. And it relates to kind of some recent things coming on the heels of city councilors proposing that racism leads to crisis, and the community rising up once again to say, actually,
it is a crisis.
And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today.
Yep.
Maybe not in terms of, the 2 years too late acknowledgement that racism is in fact a crisis by our local government, but the fact that this has been a crisis and there are serious ramifications when fringe ideas enter the mainstream and are pushed forward by political figureheads, or I guess they're not just figureheads at this point, leaders. And one of those big things that we're talking about today is the replacement theory. I think of it both as a horror show and kind of a comedy, because when I think of replacement theory, I think of the imperialist colonizers cannot deal with the ramifications of their predecessors. And that's essentially how I think of it. But we're going to dig into it, and we're going to talk about it today. So, Bob, let's go. Where are we started?
So I think, the idea of replacement theory is an old one. It's not. So what's troubling to me, and I guess the historian in me sort of gets rubbed the wrong way, because the New York Times a few days ago had an article about replacement theory and treated it as like it was this new aberration. And when I teach immigration history, for the longest time, I've always taught this notion, because it's really something that's been around since the mid to late 19th century in one form or another. People didn't necessarily have the technical wording to call it a theory or whatever it would be. But the notion basically is, and you're right in terms of thinking of it as empire and the consequence, the bottom line is that people that uphold this notion of replacement theory project out to the rest of the world that hordes of basically non-Aryans, non-white people, non-Northern Europeans basically, are going to come in and take over your space. And the vocabulary in the late 19th century referred to people as grasshoppers and locusts, and sort of called it like a plague, that people would be coming in. And the idea again is that the people who are arriving on our shores, the immigrants who are coming into Lowell in the late 19th century, for some in Lowell they were deemed unworthy, and that they were seen as a plague, and they would displace culture, music, art, drama, all the things of the West, and sort of bastardize the culture as they arrived. And that's generally the argument. More recently, which I'm sure you remember, in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, a young woman named Heather Heyer is killed at a white supremacist rally in Virginia, and people are chanting in that rally, people carrying the tiki torches and whatnot, "You will not replace us," and repeating that slogan over and over again. And that's really where I think for a lot of people, it's sort of like, well, what are they talking about?
Right.
You will not replace us. What does this mean? And that's when people begin to dig in again and think about the theory.
Oh my goodness. And as you said, a lot of these articles are treating it like it's something new. But there was that one French guy, Rationale Camus. I don't know if I'm saying his name appropriately, but he's there in his fortress, in his castle, saying, "Oh, they're invading," but who is he talking about? Who do they think are going to replace him? And the fact that it's like I said before, becoming this mainstream sentiment, that is very much, coming on the heels of that Trump presidency and the things that he was saying at the time. But now you have people like Tucker Carlson making it seem like it's just so matter of fact. like, what was Camus talking about at that time?
So the idea again is that there's a sort of body, I guess you could say, of elites. A lot of the impetus for this stuff came from places like Harvard and MIT and Princeton and Yale. A lot of philosophers and educators, teachers of one sort or another at these elite institutions were really sort of the mindset that people coming from African countries or Southern or Eastern European countries couldn't measure up intellectually, that there was something, there was sort of like this biological determinism that meant that they could never measure up to this standard, and therefore if too many of that ilk, using their terminology, arrived, it would weaken the fabric of society. And so, again, the idea is that you have classical music, you have, certain kinds of art, whatever it would be, you have systems of democracy. People would take the position that newcomers wouldn't understand the ballot, wouldn't understand the vote, wouldn't understand jurisprudence, legal system, jury system, that it would be too difficult for people to grasp. But bottom line too is this this sort of ahistorical way they think about it, because there were people here before them. If anything, a lot of the people that are channeling this sort of "you're going to replace us" were people that came in and essentially committed genocide in America toward Native peoples who were already here. That's really who should have been screaming the loudest, if you will, about, wait a minute, what are you doing? We were here. And so again, there's sort of like this weird irony where somehow they think they come from this perspective of superiority. And right, in their fortresses or whatever it would be, sort of like, Bond villains or something, with their money. And just and they set themselves up as the arbiters of what's good and not. And sort of they've assumed this posture of they're the gatekeepers, right? They're the guardians at the gate. They're the gatekeepers. They're the people who allow people into the club. It's like there's a rope line, right? And if you're not on the list, you're not supposed to get in. Trying to make it like a metaphor that people can relate to, right? You're not you're not one of the good immigrants, so you're not on the list. Get to the back of the line.
And we saw this kind of come up again in 2021 with like the census data, and where I think we had even discussed it over email that in 2010 there was a larger population of white citizens here, and then by 2020 it had decreased, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was significant. And so there's this fear of a loss of power, clearly, and that's not just here, right? It's everywhere. When you think that your way is the only right way, I almost said white, maybe a Freudian slip there. I think I can understand the threat. I don't feel good about understanding that. I often try to put myself in the place of others who I consider less fortunate than I am to have the ability to think critically and to think about the history that's come before us. And I think what we're witnessing is that terrifying fear that I am no longer the center of the world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a quote. This is the person. So just to create context, this person, president of MIT, Civil War hero, one of the leading economists in the country. This is what he says about this topic that we're discussing. And he's also the director of the census. This is in 1886 that he says this, right? The native element, but he doesn't mean Native Americans. He means native-born white people, right, when he uses that term. The native element failed to maintain its previous rate of increase because the foreigners came in such swarms. The American shrank from the industrial competition thrust upon him. He was unwilling himself to engage with the lowest kind of day labor with these new elements of the population. He was even more unwilling to bring sons and daughters into the world to enter that competition. So again, it's sort of like they're looking at things like birth rates, and they're overly generalizing family size, family type, but then also basically when you think about what he says here, that the native-born population, the white population he's defending, are so weak that they can't compete. That's really what he's saying, but he's couching it in this way that somehow, again, these people are coming in, they're invading. In Britain, this is a big deal now in England as well, and people are really pushing this idea in London that London is now majority non-white, and that London's not our city anymore, whatever our city ever was. Right, and so again, you get this you get this thing like the other day, if people are following the news, where Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, they have a policy now that if people arrive in England seeking asylum, they've essentially outsourced asylum seekers. They started a program that put people on planes and shipped them to Rwanda, and that's where they can wait and file for asylum. And so and one of the European courts has sort of intervened and told them they can't do it. But they basically the other day there were planes on the tarmac ready to go, and they were stopped at the last minute. Wow. But that again is part of this idea of sending people back, which is also what was happening, and it has been happening. I mean, we in the U.S. keep doing the same thing. We've deported and put more and more people on planes. What's happening is the current administration is not like broadcasting it in the same way that the Trump presidency was. Trump was proud of it and doing it in this very robust way that led to a lot of people protesting. But the same thing's happening within the Biden White House, but people aren't paying that much attention because you are if it's happening to your community.
Right.
But otherwise, they're just doing it very quietly. But it's all part of this idea. And in Lowell, as you were talking about with the census, it's the scales have definitely tipped. I mean, Lowell would be significantly smaller absent immigration and absent refugee arrivals over the last 20 to 30 years. The census makes that really clear. So you can either embrace that as a positive and think about all that energy and good food and music and culture and brain power and contribution to civic engagement and everything all that energy that it brings, or you can like hide in your closet. And the replacement theory people are really telling everybody, hide in your closet until we can figure this out.
Right, and it's not, it's baffling because we've seen this anti-immigration sentiment, like you said, over the last 100, 200 years, and folks calling themselves natives, and we're seeing that same rhetoric pop up in the political discourse of native voters, and it really blows my mind. Like, this whole thing is just, how do you disconnect that sentiment with what's going on and what has been going on? We keep saying like these mass shooters, oh no, they're just mentally ill, but they're all citing this exact rhetoric, and so many, not just the ones that have happened recently, and it's not always racially motivated, it's also anti-LGBT, and even the whole anti-abortion movement seems to be connected to this with thinking about birth rates. And they're talking about it in what you said, the early 19th century or mid-19th century, but they're talking about it again here now. And that's why we have things like Roe v. Wade being challenged, or it just feels all really scary, Bob.
Right, and it's global. I mean, that's the other thing that's really striking about this is because you had mass shooting in New Zealand, and the people that perpetrated that sort of claimed this as part of their guiding principle. The person that shot up the grocery store in Buffalo a few weeks back the same way. And so these things all sort of intersect. And I think the more mainstream media has become more tuned in, I think, particularly after what happened with George Floyd, but as well the incidents in Virginia with Heather Heyer and everything that was happening there, because people were chanting, "You will not replace us." And so that made people, well, what are they talking about? You will not replace us. Like, what do you mean, right? And I mean, so in the late 19th century, this was this was fueled by a lot of anti-Catholicism. This was also fueled by a real hatred of Jewish people as well. This was a very anti-Semitic movement at the time. And I mean, here's another. I mean, I've been reading more than I normally would, but the quotes kind of give you this sense, right? And so there's this guy Madison Grant, who writes a lot about this stuff, and he's very high up in New York society. He's the founder of the New York Zoological Society. He's this very sort of statusy person, and he says, America is being swept toward a racial abyss. The type of American of colonial descent will become extinct. Right? I mean, and here's another one. This is in the same time period. This is now early 20th century. This is a congressman from Michigan. The Goths and the Vandals of the modern era. This is what how he's referring to immigrants coming into the country. They come only to lay waste, to degrade and to destroy. They bring with them ignorance, degraded morals, a low standard of civilization, and no motive of intended citizenship. And here's where it gets really interesting. Like the vast flights of grasshoppers and locusts that a few years since devastated our western prairie states, they sweep down upon our fields of labor to devour and strip from us the benefit of our customs and the laws protecting American labor, and then take their flight again back to the breeding places from which they came.
Oh my goodness.
This is in the congressional record. This is a statement on the floor of the United States Congress in the debate that's going on in the early 20th century about whether or not to stop immigration. Here's one more. This is from a Harvard University scientist, 1893, an article he wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. The European peasant immigrant, quote, is essentially the same as the Southern Negro. Centuries of experience have bred in him the understanding that he is by nature a peasant. Centuries of breeding have checked the development of all these motives and aspirations, which are the foundations of our democracy. There has been stamped in an indelible manner the sign of inferiority on the laboring classes of the old world. So this is not, and the reason that I'm like sort of more, again, reading more than normal, because we've talked about this a lot. The vocabulary means something, and when people are talking about locusts and grasshoppers and sort of plagues and being overrun, being devoured, all these sorts of things, this is a powerful imagery that then these characters, who are the leading supposed citizens of the country, are sending out. And they're scaring the bejeebers out of people.
Yeah.
And they're whipping up a hatred, a bitterness, and essentially giving people this ammunition in a way to blame the other, whoever that might be in your neighborhood, for all of your problems. It's their fault, right? If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be the way I am. They did this to me. They basically, as this earlier, quote says, they devoured and stripped from me the benefits of my customs and laws. And so again, this is really, and the one I just read is striking to me in terms of the equating to African Americans and sort of like lumping. And again, here's where you see everything being folded up together, and people's points of view really become clear. Right. I mean, you just don't like anybody that's different than you, and you're now rolling them all up in a big ball here and sort of equating, and making this be this incredibly nefarious. It's like people in Europe are conspiring to get on a rickety ship and risk drowning in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to come here and steal your democracy, as if that's like what's on people's mind when they're leaving northern Italy or southern Russia. They see this as a conspiracy. Right,
and that exact sentiment has continued, and it's really scary when you think about like the access that people have nowadays to just on these like 4chan and Reddit to compound these conspiracies. And then you see, like, I was hearing rhetoric during the Obama administration that, oh, well, racism is going to die out. We've got a black president now, and we don't have to worry because it's the old dinosaurs that are racist, and they're all going to die soon, right? But who are the people who are the most influenced by these conspiracy theories now? Who are the people who are committing these acts against these groups of people? It's these young white males. They're the ones who are being indoctrinated.
Mm-hmm.
Political leaders saying things like this that have carried on into today's world, and coming into the mainstream, where now you're seeing things like, we don't want to have proper education. Basically, is, we know what proper education is. We're banning books that teach about critical race theory. We're banning critical race theory. We're banning facts, historical facts, from being taught. Why is that happening? And we've talked about all of this before, but it all comes back to this.
I mean, it overlaps now as well with sort of the culture wars of sort of everything being projected around transgender rights, and sort of like, again, it's like this conspiracy. They're trying to snatch your kid, right? They want to go into a bathroom and like steal your kid. So I watch a lot of soccer, right? European soccer. I love soccer. And when you watch, so I think about this replacement theory stuff when I watch soccer. Because if you watch like the British, the French, the German, the Dutch World Cup soccer teams, and you look at who's on the pitch, as they call the field, the pitch, if you look at who's playing, there's hardly a white face in sight on these teams that are the British team, and it's, as you started, when we started discussing this earlier today, it's the empire, right? And it's the fact that people from this empire that you basically cultivated, now the children of that empire are moving to London or moving to Munich or moving to wherever, and are really good soccer players. And you, like, on one side of your mouth, they're invading and they're doing this and they're doing that, but out the other side of your mouth, you're screaming and cheering for your national football team that is nowhere near what you think of when you think of, let's make Germany great again, or let's make London great again, or let's make America great again. That's all code for white. Right? But again, you're like going crazy cheering for your global soccer team in the World Cup, as people will be doing in a few months in December, November and December. And I mean, even the U.S. team now, the U.S. team for the longest time was totally white. It was always getting whooped, basically, whenever it played any other place where people actually had, at least in sport, somewhat gotten over that crap, right? And now the U.S. team is a little bit better the last 2 or 3 years, but when you look on the pitch, it's much more representative of what the country is in terms of its population. And now people are coming onto the team who come from backgrounds where soccer was their sport, not football, American football or baseball. But I mean, there's a great movie that I use a lot when I teach called Harvest of Empire. And that's essentially the gist of the film, that this stir in America, this sort of consequence of empire, of us being out and about in the world, in the Dominican Republic or in Mexico or in Central America. Well, of course, then that stirs resentments, that stirs controversy, that stirs all sorts of economic change and whatnot, and people are leaving the Dominican Republic because the economy is tough, partly through what we've done, or Puerto Rico, or wherever it would be, or Honduras, or Colombia, or whatever, and they're coming here. The harvest of the empire, one of those harvests is these people. But yet again, we're, like pushing over here. And the vocabulary, again, like the other day, there's like a whole bunch of people now, a large caravan of people that are moving through Central America, getting close to the Mexican border, sort of heading, they're thinking they're going to get into the United States. But the United States is very aggressively pushing people back. And so you can watch different news reports of it. And some, like on MSNBC, they won't call it a horde or an invasion. They'll call it a caravan or something. It's a slightly less loaded word than Fox. Fox's headline will be invasion from the south.
Oh my God.
And it's this. I mean, if they could get away with, which they probably could, if they could get away with referring to people as locusts or grasshoppers, they probably would.
I'll tell you, not to give them any credit, but they're definitely linguistic geniuses. You use all of these words to trick your base, and they buy it.
Right.
It feeds and stokes the flames, and now they're going to do your dirty work for you. Like, that's how I think of it.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that is interesting is, like, in a city like Lowell, where so many of the groups that came in sizable numbers in the mid to late 19th century and more recently as well, were bitterly opposed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, French Canadians were seen as this scourge on Lowell when they were coming in, and they were lumped together with the group that was really most vilified in America at this point, other than African Americans, which were Chinese immigrants. And the French Canadians were referred to in Massachusetts as the Chinese of the East Coast. And that wasn't a kind reference when they were referred to that way. And the Irish were bitterly opposed because of their Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a false rumor in Lowell in 1860, as people were ramping up to potentially fight in the Civil War. There were Irish volunteers from Lowell who were in regiments, and anti-Catholic Protestants in Lowell basically started spreading rumors around the city that these Irish regiments were going to join the South and fight the North, none of which was even remotely true, but it was fake news, the kind of same thing we would have now, but it was like this real, but it could have caused this real interesting, very, very bitter clash between groups, because wait, my son is going to fight for the North, but you over there are going to go down south and come back and fight against my son. None of which was true. And so we continue to do this, and yet again we get foiled and fooled into thinking somehow this idea that we love to separate ourselves. Well, at least I'm not them. There's a need people have for this explanation of history to essentially cover the fact that in many respects their lives have not turned out the way they thought they would be. Either wherever it would be, in Europe or in the United States, where the economy is really difficult right now. We know there's inflation. We know there's high fuel prices. If we can find somebody to blame our current economic system on, if we can lay blame somewhere else, all to the good. And this is a really convenient, dangerous, loaded gun, no pun intended here, to rile people up, stir people up. And it's something, again, that we need to do a far better job sort of having more of a conversation like what we're having now about all this, and try to, particularly like at high school level and whatnot, actually be able to teach this stuff in a better way. But it's fascinating that they're also trying to push back against it even being taught.
Well,
yeah, we're in a box.
We definitely are, and it's getting a little, it's getting too real out there. I'll leave our viewers with this. When you're so used to privilege and oppressing others, sharing of power is what makes you feel now like the oppressed group, and you're not. We're all here. There is enough for everybody, and we really need to work together because climate change is real. So, there's a whole lot of things going on, but it's a scary topic. Thank you, Bob, for bringing it forward, and I think that we just all need to kind of learn a little bit more about this and educate each other, educate the youth. And that is the only thing that I feel like I have for a solution right now. Education. Yep. With facts. Thank you for tuning in. This has been History on Lowell.